Scarlett, the auto industry is just one example of how the Japanese earthquake has disrupted the global supply chain and with serious consequences for the companies that you mentioned and economies as well. Jim Lawton has been on the front lines of the supply chain industry since he first worked for Hewlett-Packard. He's now president of D&B Supply Management Solutions. He joins us from Boston this morning. Jim, this is kind of, out of the... You're on the front lines, but most people can't even see them. So explain to us just how serious is the supply chain disruption as a result of the Japanese earthquake?
Yeah, there's no question, Eric. There are going to be companies that definitely go out of business as a result of what we've seen in Japan. And not just the companies in Japan, but there are going to be companies in the United States, there are going to be companies in Europe, there are going to be companies in Canada that just cease to exist because they're dependent on the components and the parts that are coming from Japan. In fact, we just heard from Ford earlier this week, if you want to buy a car from Ford, you can, as long as it's not in tuxedo black. Well, the Ford cars aren't made in Japan, but the paint for tuxedo black is.
Jim, how on earth did this happen? We've seen supply chain disruptions before. Surely, the global corporate world had a better sense of how to source things. Why would any company be so reliant on a small number of suppliers in one country like Japan?
Well, if you think about the last 5 years, it's really been about how can supply chains contribute to the business. And predominantly for many companies, that's been how can we lower our cost structure. So I want fewer suppliers, not more. I'd rather be single sourced than have multiple suppliers. I want to take as much inventory out of the system as possible. I want to offshore where I can. All of those strategies were focused on reducing the cost structure. The problem is that what they also did is made supply chains much more brittle. If I rely on parts today that I got yesterday in order to be able to build, and tomorrow I can't get those parts, well, the day after I'm not going to be able to put the parts together, I'm not going to be able to ship to customers, I'm not going to be able to meet Wall Street expectations. So the very aggressive focus that we've seen on cost structure over the last 5 years has really driven companies to these single source strategies, and now there's a real opportunity, I think, for companies to really revisit those. Do we continue to want to employ just-in-time strategies, or maybe it's just-in-case inventory strategies? That's the question people will be thinking through over the next several months.
Jim, is Japan the loser here, or is there going to be a global rebalancing of the supply chain that ultimately allows things to sort of work out more or less the way they are now?
Yeah, so if you think of what happened in the 24 hours after this event, you had every procurement organization, every chief procurement officer sitting down saying, how bad are the issues, what are our alternatives, and where do we go? And the progressive companies were on a plane in 24 hours to other parts of the world looking for sources. So they were headed to Singapore, they were headed to Malaysia, they were headed to Indonesia, looking for ways of securing the supply that they need to be able to continue to meet customer expectations. In the short term, it's clearly going to have a negative impact on Japan because they'll be looking for those sources from other locations. At the same time, there are challenges with that. If you look at, if I'm buying high-tech components from Japan, they're one of the largest exporters of high-tech components. If I am now buying them from some other part of the world, say, for example, Malaysia, so are all of my colleagues. So the name of the game is, can I secure that supply before my competitors and other companies eat that up? The challenge has been over the last recession, a lot of capacity has gone offline. And so unlike in previous recessions where it's very quickly been pulled back up and started up again, it's going to be very difficult. We're going to see a number of allocation issues for the next several months.
Jim, how does it play out in China? For years, we've heard that the Chinese just didn't have the quality to measure up to countries like Japan. Have they raised their game enough to be able to take market share from Japan and perhaps from Malaysia, Singapore as well?
That's the issue. The reality is there's 200 million plus companies in the world. Many of these relationships that were established in Japan were established over years, creating an understanding of how do the suppliers in Japan manage their production processes? How do we match our designs to the process capabilities of these companies in Japan? To think that we can switch, whether it's Singapore or China, and then very quickly get those quality levels to the same level that they were in Japan is just not realistic. So then what that leads to is, what are some of the strategies I can employ? How do I identify the best companies to work with? How can I quickly vet out whether or not they've got high quality processes in place that I can rely on? And then how do I put the right monitoring mechanisms in place so that if I do start to run into issues, I find out about it quickly and I can deal with them quickly? That's
Jim,
what companies are going to be doing.
It's a fascinating situation, clearly, with some big winners and losers. Good of you to join us this morning. We'd love to have you back. Jim Lawton, president of D&B Supply Management Solutions, with us from Boston.